Hello there and welcome to this presentation I've passionately titled Has Science Buried God? My name is Matt Watts and I want to submit for your consideration the following information and evidence that I believe clearly demonstrate that far from burying God, as many today would profess, science in fact supports very much so a belief in God. So let's go ahead and get started. Typically we're presented with two choices, God or science. And the overall argument being that the laws of physics, mathematics, can provide a satisfactory explanation for the origin of the universe. Science is ultimately the only way to truth, therefore we don't need God. Stephen Hawking, who's a household name in science, a leading scientist, has said, "The laws of physics and not the will of God provide the real explanation of how life on Earth came into being." Hawking also said, "Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing." In other words, the law of gravity can displace God. Today, many would have you believe that you must choose between a belief in God or science. And the question is it really just one or the other? If it really is such an enormous battle between science as one choice and God as another choice, as mutually exclusive options, consider Stephen Hawking, who's regarded as perhaps the greatest living physicist in the world today. He's an atheist. On the other hand, we have William D. Phillips, who's the winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics. He's a Christian. Okay. So is it really just one or the other? In the previous slide, we have two scientists who are at the top of their field in science. Is it their science that they disagree on? No, absolutely not. Another example of this is the Human Genome Project, arguably one of the most influential and famous projects of science in our time. The first director of that project was James Watson, who was the co-Nobel Prize winner with Francis Crick for discovering the DNA code. He is also an atheist. The second director, Francis Collins, who's currently the director of the Institute of Health in the United States, he's a Christian. Okay? So all of these brilliant men study the same subject and are at the very top of the field in science, in their respective fields. And yet they share different worldviews. So how can this be? And I want to submit to you that it's not between science and God, it's actually a clash of two worldviews. The reality is not God versus science, it's actually theism versus atheism. It's a clash between these two worldviews that are diametrically opposed in explaining ultimate reality. So let's get a basic understanding of atheism, also known as materialism, naturalism, reductionism. It's the belief that mass energy ultimately is all that exists and nothing else. Everything can be reduced down to its material makeup of chemicals and atoms, and therefore explains everything bottom up. Hence, we are simply the product of mindless, unguided processes mixed with chance. Richard Dawkins has stated, "There is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music." And most atheists would fall under the category of believing this basic premise. On the other hand, we have theism, with the basic explanation being that basically can be summed up in one sentence: God created the heavens and the earth. It's a belief in a personal God, a creator, a designer, a sustainer of the universe. There's obvious fine-tuning in the universe because there is a fine-tuner behind it. There is a moral law, which there seems to be, which would then require a moral lawgiver. There is rational intelligibility of the universe that points us to a supreme rational intelligence in charge of it all. This being is God. So the real question then is, rather than the question of being God versus science, being opposed one to another, the better question is, and I can't stress this enough, is that where does science fit in determining which of these worldviews is true? We have theism on one hand, we have atheism on the other hand, and in the middle we have science. We have the evidence, we have the data presented to both parties. And the real question is, where does the evidence point? Does the evidence that we have tend to point towards a creator God? Or does it point towards a mindless, unguided process of atoms in empty space? Okay, and that is the backdrop that I want to present the following information and evidence to you with, is this question: where does the evidence point? Does it point to a mind, to God, to a creator, or to mindless, unguided processes of atoms in empty space? Okay. So to do this, I'd like to divide it into three categories. The first being the history of science. Okay. Secondly, the nature and philosophy of science, and then, of course, the results of science. So the history of modern science as we know it, and many people don't understand this, but it was fueled by a belief in God. According to Alfred North Whitehead, in the year 1500, Europe knew less than Archimedes, who died in the year 212 BC. Yet, in the year 1700, Newton's Principia had been written, and the world was well started on the modern epoch. So the question is, what led to this meteoric explosion in the West of interest in formulating the universe and understanding how it works in the mathematical terms? Ironically, the very modern science many espouse shows no evidence of God. It was all started and pursued by those who did believe they were unlocking the mysteries of God. Johannes Kepler was stated that as he was making his discoveries, many of which we still use today, was that he was thinking God's thoughts after him. Foundation of modern science. Modern science as we know it exploded onto the world stage in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Well, why then? Why there? And I feel like C.S. Lewis summed it up very nicely when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So far from belief in God hindering science, it was the very motor that drove it. Today's science stands on the shoulders of giants. So I want to go through a few of these giants of science that we stand on their work today. Copernicus, he was the astronomer who put forth the first math-based system of planets revolving around our sun. Sir Francis Bacon established the scientific method of inquiry based on experimentation and deductive reasoning. Johannes Kepler was a brilliant mathematician and astronomer, and he established the laws of planetary motion about the sun and discovered planetary orbits, that they were not circular but elliptical. In fact, it was based on a lot of his discoveries and laws that NASA used to help us land on the moon. Galileo, father of modern astronomy, he discovered the moons of Jupiter. He constructed the first known complete astronomical telescope. Descartes was a mathematician and scientist and philosopher, and has been called the father of modern philosophy. Blaise Pascal was a mathematician and physicist, inventor, writer, and theologian. Among other things, he invented a mechanical calculator, established principles of vacuums and pressures of air. Okay, we've got Isaac Newton, obviously one of the greats. His genius is undisputed. He discovered the law of gravitation and is the father of calculus. Michael Faraday, and I'm going to go a little bit quickly here due to time. Gregor Mendel, William Thomson Kelvin, James Clerk Maxwell, Max Planck, obviously Einstein. And although he never coming to a belief in a personal God, he certainly did recognize the impossibility of a non-created universe and opposed atheism. Okay? He said, and I quote, "I do not share the crusading spirit of the professional atheist. I prefer an attitude of humility corresponding to the weakness of our intellectual understanding of nature and of our own being. I want to know how God created this world. I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know His thoughts. The rest are details. That deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe forms my idea of God. So let's review the Nobel Prize winners over history. Again, the greats in their individual fields. Okay. And I found it quite interesting as I was studying this that Christians make up over 33% of the world's population, right? And yet they have earned 65% of Nobel Prizes. That's quite astonishing. And as far as the breakdown goes, overall Christians have won 78% of Nobel Prizes in peace, 72% in chemistry, 65% in physics, and 62% in medicine. So how can a scientist ever believe in God? Well, my answer to this is that the more you study a topic, the more you become to appreciate that field of study, right? So for instance, the more you study engineering, the more you appreciate and admire that much more a turbojet engine than someone who studies applied basket weaving, let's say. The more you study art, the more deeply you appreciate the genius of a Rembrandt or the works of Michelangelo versus a person who's never done any art. The more you study and understand architecture, the more you can admire the Eiffel Tower, the Taj Mahal, and the genius of the mind who did it that way. And likewise, the more you understand science, the more you can admire the genius of a God who did it that way. And Isaac Newton understood this. When he discovered the law of gravitation, did he say, "Oh, that's marvelous, I know how it works and now I don't need God"? Instead, he wrote one of the most brilliant books in the history of science, even to this day considered one of the most brilliant books in science, the Principia Mathematica. And in it, he had the express hope that it would persuade the thinking person to believe in God. In Principia, he stated, "The most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." Newton, along with other early scientists, own motivation for scientific advancement was because of their faith in God. So let's go into the nature of science. Can science explain everything? Well, it's quite easy to see that science is wholly inadequate in even answering the questions of a child. Where did we come from? Who are we? Why are we here? How should we live? Where are we going? The belief that science can give us everything is simply not true. In fact, Peter Medawar, who is a Nobel Prize winner, he's an atheist and a world-renowned biologist. He said, "Rationalism falls short of answering the many simple and childlike questions people like to ask. These are intellectual pains that rationalists, like bad physicians confronted by ailments they cannot diagnose or cure, are apt to dismiss as imagination." Science is limited. And even Einstein very clearly saw the shortcomings of science when he said, "You can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. Every attempt to reduce ethics to scientific formulae must fail." And let's think about it. Science can discover if things harm, but not why it is wrong to harm. For instance, science can tell us if you put cyanide in your grandmother's tea, it's going to give her a very terrible afternoon. In fact, it'll kill her. But science cannot tell you if you ought to do it in order to get her property. Do God and science compete as explanations? What does it mean to say that science explains? And this is another very important premise. Explanation has different levels. So, for instance, did Newton banish God when he discovered the law of gravitation? No, absolutely not. It's because he knew there is a difference in God as an explanation and science as an explanation. So let's dive into this a little bit further. Does science fully explain? Let's take gravity. Newton's law of gravity does not explain what gravity is. Did you ever think about that? In fact, science still can't do that today. It still cannot fully explain gravity. It simply gives us a mathematical way of calculating the effect of gravity. Energy. Science can't explain what energy is. They can only measure it. Science cannot tell us what consciousness is. Science is wholly inadequate in explaining what consciousness is. We only make reference to it. Science provides us with descriptions that give us powerful predictive capacity. And the great philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said, "The great delusion of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations for the phenomena of nature." So it's important to understand explanation has different levels. For instance, why is the kettle boiling? Well, a scientist might come and explain that's because energy from the gas of the Bunsen burner is transmitted to the base of the kettle and to the water molecules to such an extent the water molecules are agitated, they become more and more agitated to the point that they begin to fly off and the pressure builds up, etc., etc. And thus you have boiling water. Whereas I could tell you, no, it's not, it's boiling because I want a cup of tea, right? So which one is correct? Which one is incorrect? Well, clearly there are at least two different kinds of explanation. The scientific explanation describing things in terms of math, physics, and chemistry, and an agent explanation which accounts for intelligent involvement. So let's take a look at an example. Henry Ford and the Model T. Let's say we come across an old Ford Model T, and we've got a group of scientists and we ask ourselves, how do we explain this? There will be some that say they can explain it in terms of natural laws and mechanism, namely engineering and the law of internal combustion. You're going to have others that say Henry Ford. Well, which one is it? Well, they say, well, you can only choose one. It's either the laws of physics or the man who created it. Well, common sense and logic tells us the truth that you surely need both. You need the agent who designed it plus scientific law. Hopefully you can see here that God and science are no more opposed as explanations than Henry Ford is opposed to the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the automobile, right? And it's also noteworthy to add that it's not just Henry Ford and just physics alone that you need. You need matter, which is also not produced by the laws of physics. Scientific laws and theories cannot create anything on their own. They provide descriptions of what normally happens given set circumstances. So for instance, Stephen Hawking's example in his latest book, the sun always rises in the east. Well, if we take that law, for instance, the sun always rises in the east, the law didn't create the sun, nor does it make the sun move. Newton's law of gravity does not create gravity, nor the matter on which gravity acts. It doesn't even explain what gravity is. Laws are simply descriptive and predictive, but not creative. Scientific laws and theories cannot even cause anything on their own. So Newton's laws of motion do not cause a billiard bar to move across a pool table. The laws can help us analyze once you have the ball in motion, but the laws are powerless to move it. So, if not God, then how is life on Earth explained according to the experts? So we have a few explanations here that we're going to review and consider. We have, of course, Darwinism. where the basic premise being that all life is related and has descended from a common ancestor. The birds and the bananas, the fishes and the flowers are all related. This theory presumes the development of life from non-life and stresses a purely naturalistic, which simply means a mindless, unguided process of descent with modification. That is, that complex creatures evolve from more simplistic ancestors naturally over time. In other words, here's how it works. Chandra Wickramasinghe, who's also a very famous scientist, said, and I quote, "It is ridiculous to suppose that the information provided by one single primitive bacterium can be upgraded by copying to produce a man and all other living things that inhabit our planet. This conventional wisdom, as it is called, is similar to the proposition that the first page of Genesis, copied billions upon billions of times, would eventually accumulate enough copying errors and hence enough variety to produce not merely the entire Bible, but all the holding of all the major libraries of the world." In other words, from a single-cell organism, we get the complexity and beauty of a human being. But that's not all. It's important to note that even Darwinism does not account for the origin of life. It does not explain nor claim how life got started. Instead, Darwinian evolution presupposes life. You have to have life to begin with to even have Darwinian evolution. It assumes self-replicating cells, cells which have all the built-in complexity of a supercomputer. So it doesn't even fully explain, if it does explain. Frederick Hoyle, who is a very famous astrophysicist and cosmologist, he was the professor of astronomy and experimental philosophy at Cambridge. He's the winner of a Crafoord Prize. He's also an atheist. Okay, he was the one that coined the Big Bang as a term. He said it this way: "The chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way, meaning matter plus time plus chance, is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein." Okay, this was Frederick Hoyle speaking directly to Darwinian evolution. He also said, "A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. The facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." And again, this is Frederick Hoyle, a very famous mind in the scientific field who is an atheist, saying these things. Right, and there's my little animation there of a tornado plus a junkyard, and voila, we have a perfectly functioning, capable 747 as a result. Francis Crick and James Watson, Nobel Prize winners for their discovery of the DNA code. Both of these guys, they're outspoken atheists, okay? And in fact, it was their pursuit that led them to uncovering the DNA code that they hoped to disprove God. Okay, interestingly enough, this is what Francis Crick said: "An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going." Crick acknowledged the growing problems of his ideas when he said, "Every time I write a paper on the origin of life, I swear I will never write another one, because there is too much speculation running after too few facts." Panspermia, this is another ideology here. And to overcome the huge hurdles of evolution of life from non-living matter is this theory used to explain the origin of life on Earth. Okay, this is a bona fide, legitimate theory. Okay, and it was Francis Crick, even Frederick Hoyle, Chandra Wickramasinghe, a lot of these leading scientists that I just got done quoting proposed and were proponents of panspermia. Okay, to explain. So Crick and Leslie Orgel suggested, driven by some form of missionary zeal, an ancient intelligent alien race could have constructed suitable interstellar robot spacecraft, loaded these vehicles with an appropriate cargo of microorganisms, spores, or bacteria, and then proceeded to seed the galaxy with life, or at least the precursors of life. Sir Frederick Hoyle and Chandra Vikramasinghe further suggested that arrival of these cosmic microorganisms and the resultant complexity of terrestrial life is not a random process, but one carried out under the influence of a greater cosmic intelligence. I cannot stress that enough, that these giants of the field in science who staunchly disbelieved in there being a God behind the creation of this earth and of life as we know it, fully admitted and fully recognized that life as we understand it and know it, the complexity of it, the beauty of it, the preciseness of it, is not, again, using their words, is not a random process, but one carried out under the influence of a greater cosmic intelligence. And to resolve their understanding, they came up with this panspermia hypothesis. But that's not all, okay? Important to note here as well that although this theory provides a concept regarding how life got started on this earth, namely that intelligence is responsible and intelligence is behind life on this earth, it still presupposes the existence of life itself, right? Just like Darwinism, it's completely inadequate, and it does not address how life ultimately got started. All it does is it just pushes it into outer space, right? So, don't ask them who built the ship, right? Because then it just pushes it out another layer. The laws of mathematics created the universe. Okay, this is another idea. Peter Atkins, he's an atheist professor of chemistry at Oxford University. He's a prolific author of many books, including many university textbooks. He said that the laws of mathematics created the universe. Okay. Space-time generates its own dust in the process of its own self-assembly. So he, along with other atheist scientific scholars, believe this idea that the laws of mathematics created the universe. Okay, so let's dive into this a little bit further. Peter Atkins dubs this the cosmic bootstrap principle, referring to the self-contradictory idea of a person lifting himself off the ground by pulling on his own bootlaces, right? So Keith Ward says Atkins' view of the universe is as blatantly self-contradictory as the name he gives to it, pointing out that it is logically impossible for a cause to bring about some effect without already being in existence. Ward concludes, between the hypothesis of God and the hypothesis of a cosmic bootstrap, there is no competition. We are always right to think that persons or universes who seek to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps are forever doomed to failure. Okay? And again, let's remember that laws by themselves have no power to create, right? They simply describe and have a powerful predictive capability to describe, but not create. And so once again, theories and laws do not bring matter and energy into existence. Let's use a simple law of arithmetic. I have $1, I have another dollar, that gives me $2. Did 1 plus 1 ever put $2 in anyone's pocket? Absolutely not. If I put $1,000 into the bank and later on put another $1,000, the laws of arithmetic would explain very simply how I now have $2,000 in the bank. But if I never put any money in the bank to begin with, and I simply leave it up to the laws of arithmetic, I'm going to be permanently bankrupt. C.S. Lewis said it brilliantly. bookkeeping continued to eternity, could never produce 1 farthing. Likewise it is with the laws of nature and of science that we have. So let's move on to another ideology to propose and explain, or to rather dismiss God. And let's go back to Stephen Hawking's explanation that I quoted in the very beginning. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. Okay, and it's important for me to say this. The entire central argument of his book, The Grand Design, is based on this one statement here. Okay, the laws of physics and not the will of God provide the real explanation of how life on earth came into being. Okay, so let's dive into this one statement here, okay, and point out the contradictions that this statement has. In fact, there's 3 that I can identify here. Number 1, that the laws by themselves do not create or cause anything. Laws are abstract. Okay, that's the first contradiction in the statement. Secondly, he contradicts the law of causality. The universe can and will create itself. Okay, there's got to be an adequate antecedent or a cause for every material effect. You guys, this is the entire crux of science as we know it. The entire scientific model, everything we research with science is based on the law of causality, the law of cause and effect. Without the law of causality, science is simply impossible. And I like Stace's quote here. He says, "Every student of logic knows this is the ultimate canon of the sciences, the foundation of them all. If we did not believe in the truth of causation, namely everything which has a beginning has a cause, all the sciences would at once crumble to dust. In every scientific investigation, this truth is assumed." And Hawking flat out contradicts the law of causality in his statement, in his central argument. Number 3, how can there be a law of gravity if there is nothing? Right? Saying that there is nothing while injecting a law of gravity which is something is completely self-contradicting. The law of nature or of gravity depends on the prior existence of that nature it purports to describe. Okay? So the takeaway from this: immense prestige and authority does not compensate for faulty logic, as John Lennox has said. Nonsense remains nonsense even when taught by a world-class physicist. What serves to obscure the illogicality of such statements is the fact that they are made by famous scientists, and the general public, not surprisingly, assumes that they are statements of science and take them on authority. You guys, please understand that statements by a scientist are not necessarily statements of science. Science doesn't say anything. It's scientists that do. Science itself doesn't say anything. The data doesn't say anything. We as people, as human beings, as scientists, have to take that data and then interpret it. So now let's move on to the results of science. Is there any evidence that points towards an intelligent creator God? In our scripture, in Psalms 19:1, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." In another set of scripture, it says, "All things denote there is a God, yea, even the earth, and its motion, yea, and also all the planets which move in their regular form, do witness that there is a supreme creator." So let's look at the extreme fine-tuning of the universe. There are more than 200 known parameters necessary for a planet to support life, and every single one of which must be perfectly met or the whole thing falls apart, right? You can't have 199 of these and miss one of them. You have to have every single one of them in their entirety, in their preciseness, working exactly. And I'm just going to go through very quickly a few of them. So the distance from Earth to the Sun. If the Earth was too near, water would evaporate too quickly. If it was too far, Earth would be too cold for life. There's about a 2% change and life would simply just not exist. Okay, the Earth's rotation, if it were too slow, temperature differences between night and day would be too extreme. Too fast, and wind speeds would be disastrous. Jupiter. Without a massive gravity-rich planet like Jupiter, Earth would be bombarded with space material, meteorites, asteroids, etc. Without it, Earth would be more like an interstellar dartboard. Okay, Jupiter's like our garbage disposal. It takes all those threats and pulls it. Oxygen level precision. Oxygen, I didn't know this originally, but oxygen is simply 21% of the atmosphere. Okay. If it were 25%, fires would erupt spontaneously. If it were 15%, human beings would suffocate, right? There's just that very, very precise balance. Gravity, and this is an amazing one. If the force of gravity were altered by 0.000, however many zeros that is, 1%, our sun would not exist and neither would we. That is how precise the law of gravity has to be. Atmospheric transparency. If it were less transparent, not enough solar radiation would reach the Earth. And if it were more transparent, we would be bombarded with far too much solar radiation than what we could handle to survive. Carbon dioxide levels. If it were higher, we'd all burn up. There would be a runaway greenhouse effect. And if it were lower, plants, which rely on carbon dioxide, would not be able to maintain efficient photosynthesis and we'd all suffocate. Okay, Earth's axis. If the 23-degree tilt of the Earth were altered even slightly, surface temperatures would be too extreme for life. The Moon-Earth gravitational interaction, if it were greater, our tidal effects on the oceans, atmosphere, and rotational period would be too severe. If it were less, orbital changes would cause climatic instabilities, making life impossible. So even something that we take for granted like the moon plays such a vital importance. Water vapor levels in the atmosphere. If they were greater, a runaway greenhouse effect would cause temperatures to rise too fast for human life. And if they were less, an insufficient greenhouse effect would make Earth too cold for human life. Earth's crust, and this is an interesting one. If it were thicker, too much oxygen would be transferred to the crust to support life. And if it were thinner, volcanic and tectonic activity would make life impossible. Okay. The second law of thermodynamics is also another testament to this fine-tuning. Sir Roger Penrose, and he's a self-avowed atheist. He's considered perhaps one of the most brilliant living mathematicians today. He said, based on the second law of thermodynamics alone, his calculations lead him to the remarkable conclusion that the Creator's aim must have been accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to 123. Okay, so what that means is take a 1, follow it by 10 to the 123rd power of zeros, which, by the way, that number would be impossible to write out in the usual decimal way, because even if we were to put a 0 on every particle in the universe, there would not even be enough particles to do the job. Okay, let that sink in for a little bit, right? That is, according to a self-avowed atheist, is saying, based on the second law of thermodynamics alone, it is so precise, to such a precise degree, there's not even enough particles in the universe to represent a large enough number. So as a comparison, there's roughly 10 to the 22nd power number of planets in the universe, and there are only 10 to the 70th power of atoms in the entire universe. And Penrose is saying that you take 10 to the 123rd power. Okay. So we also have the nuclear, electromagnetic, and gravitational forces. Paul Davies, he's an English physicist, he's an agnostic. He said if the ratio of the nuclear strong force to the electromagnetic force had been different by 1 part in 10 to the 16th power, no stars could have formed. The electromagnetic force constant to the gravitational force constant, you increase it by only 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, and only small stars can exist. You decrease it by the same, and only large stars can exist. Right? That is how incredibly fine-tuned this thing is. He says, he makes the case that you must have both for life, that large stars produce elements in their thermonuclear furnaces, and only small ones burn long enough to sustain a planet with life. So we've got Paul Davies and Hugh Ross here that provide a brilliant illustration. Davies said that that this is the kind, speaking of these forces, that is the kind of accuracy a marksman would need to hit a coin at the far side of the observable universe, 20 billion light years away. And Ross, he says, cover America with coins in a column reaching to the moon. Okay, 236,000 miles away. Then do the same for 1 billion other continents of the same size. Paint 1 coin red and put it somewhere in one of the billion piles. Blindfold a friend and ask her to pick it out. The odds are about 1 in 10 to the 40 that she will. The rate of expansion. Coming back to Stephen Hawking here. So he says that if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have collapsed before it ever reached its present size. That is how incredibly fine-tuned. That even the slightest change in either direction would have led either to a too rapid of an expansion of the universe with no galaxies forming, or too slow of an expansion with consequent rapid collapse. 4 fundamental forces. We have the values of gravity, the electromagnetic force, the strong and weak nuclear forces, which were determined less than 1/1,000,000th of a second after the Big Bang. You alter any one of these values ever so slightly and the universe as we know it could not exist. Okay, Eric Metaxas says, to consider the hundreds of parameters, every one of which must be perfectly met for life as we know it to exist, and to think it all just happened, defies common sense. It would be like tossing a coin and having it come up heads 10 quintillion times in a row. I don't think so. And to show you what 10 quintillion times is, that's what it looks like. So let's move on to the evidence. Evidence of intelligence found in life itself. Okay. Coming back to Chandra Vikramasinghe, who I quoted earlier, speaking directly to the enzymatic makeup required for life. And again, we're just talking about one of hundreds, even thousands of different precisely tuned requirements for life to exist as we know it. Okay. So speaking of just the enzymatic makeup required, he says, at a conservative estimate, the probability of discovering this set by random shuffling, in other words, mindless unguided processes, is 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. The really vast improbability of 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power poses a serious dilemma for the whole of evolutionary science. Life could not be an accident, not just on Earth alone, but anywhere at all in the universe. The notion of a creator placed outside the universe is not one to which I can easily subscribe. He's admitting, I cannot easily subscribe to this notion of a creator. My own philosophical preference is for an essentially eternal, boundless universe wherein a creator of life somehow emerges in a natural way. In the present state of our knowledge about life and about the universe, an emphatic denial of some form of creation as an explanation for the origin of life implies a blindness to fact and an arrogance that cannot be condoned. That is powerful language. DNA. We know that DNA encodes the instructions for building and replicating all living things. It's the code book, it's the language. And in fact, Richard Dawkins, who's at the forefront of the atheistic debate, says that there is enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. Some amoebas have as much information in their DNA as 1,000 Encyclopedia Britannicas. Okay. Important note, these 1,000 encyclopedias worth of DNA information do not consist of random letters, but of letters in a very, very specific order or a code, just like a real encyclopedia does. So in other words, according to Richard Dawkins, we take an amoeba, a single cell organism, and the DNA within that is comparable to the information contained in 1,000 volumes of encyclopedia. Pretty powerful. So let's take a look at some examples of what's been recognized as an intelligent mind, being behind a cause accepted by the scientific community. Okay, so things that according to science we can look at and we can say definitively there is an intelligent mind that is the cause of this. Okay, let's look at some examples. We have the Blombos cave art, okay, some of the earliest known prehistoric art in all of Africa. And as you can see, I've got a picture of it there, and it's simply just some scratches on a piece of rock. Okay, and science has definitively come out and said intelligent mind is responsible for this. A few scratches on a piece of rock. We've got Ogham, early medieval alphabet used to write early Irish languages. And again, we've got some more of these scratches. We've got the Darakai Shatan cupules, which is also some of the oldest known rock art in the entire world. This is located in India. You can see there's some engravings, some spherical depressions that have been engraved there in the stone. We know that mind is responsible for these, that they're not just coincidence or caused by nature, but that there is mind behind it. Okay, you can even take a walk on the beach, and if you were to come across, let's say, four letters, transcribed in the beach there, L-O-V-E, love, you would instantaneously know that there is a mind responsible for that, that nature somehow, just the waves coming in or some mindless unguided process came in and did this. On the contrary, that you would know there was mind behind it. Okay, so my key question here is, if a few simple scratches in stone or a 4-letter word on the beach demand an intelligent mind or an intelligent being behind it, then why doesn't a precisely fine-tuned message, namely DNA, 1,000 encyclopedias long, require one? An experiment at the dinner table with a world-famous biochemist. John Lennox is the one who I'm referring to here, where he was at a dinner and he was sitting next to a self-avowed atheist, a naturalist, a reductionist, who claimed that everything comes down to physics and chemistry and atoms and empty space. We can explain and we can account for everything based on physics, chemistry, atoms, empty space. Okay. So John Lennox picks up the menu. They're having this dinner, this banquet, and he picks up the menu and he pointed out 2 words on the menu: roast chicken. Okay, and specifically just one word, roast, 5 letters long. And he asked him, do you think everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry? Yes, I do, the man said. So Lennox then says, if that's the case, explain to me how the chemical makeup of those letters convey to you the idea of roast. In other words, explain it to me in terms of chemistry and physics of the ink, how that can convey to you roast, just with chemistry and physics. And astonishingly, the confession of this gentleman was that he had this realization that it is simply not within the power of physics and chemistry to explain the intelligent informational input that is indicated by those letters carrying meaning, clearly admitting that it cannot be done. So we have, again, another example, just a 5-letter word, okay, where unless you can account for intelligence, it's impossible to explain just in terms of physics and chemistry. So how does chemistry and physics explain the meaning of a 3.5 billion letter word, the longest known in existence, our human DNA, which is in exactly the right order? What is the origin of that? Well, the atheist, the naturalist, will say that the origin of that is simply chance and the laws of nature. It's the end product of mindless, unguided processes. And my response to that is, really? Really? So life is clearly more than just chemicals, okay? Life contains a message. That message is DNA. It's expressed in chemicals. Yes, that's true. But those chemicals cannot cause the message any more than the chemicals in ink and paper can cause the sentences in a book. A message points to something beyond chemicals. The message in life, just like the one found in a book, points to an intelligence beyond its chemical makeup. And yet, so many still choose to deny. We can look at 5 letters on a menu, or even a few scratches on stone, and intuitively understand intelligent involvement. Even though in the case of a menu, there may be many mechanical, blind processes that were involved in the production of that, we still know that there's mind behind it ultimately. But yet, we turn around and we see the longest word that's ever been discovered, namely DNA, and describe it to chance and nature. In my opinion, it's the most powerful fingerprint that God has put in every one of us. It's more than a fingerprint. It contains the information that produces you, and it points upwards. Even though there may be natural, scientifically explained processes involved in the coming together of it, just like the menu, its word-like character, its program-like character point to an intelligent input. Denying the existence of God is a prior held commitment to the philosophy of atheism and not a commitment to evidence. This is a big premise of my presentation I can't underestimate. And it's worth saying again that denying the existence of God is a prior held commitment to the philosophy of atheism and not a commitment to evidence. Philip Johnson said, "You separate the philosophy from the science and the proud tower collapses." Richard Dawkins even says it's tempting. He says living objects, they look designed. They look overwhelmingly as though they're designed. It's terribly, terribly tempting to use the word designed. It's tempting to say it's been designed, and this is me coming into this, that it's tempting to say that it's been designed. It's because it has been designed. Dawkins says a serious case could be made for a deistic God. Stephen Hawking admits it's difficult to explain without God. He says, "It would be very difficult to explain why the universe should have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us. In fact, if one considers the possible constants and laws that could have emerged, the odds against a universe that has produced life like ours are immense." Stephen Hawking even recognizes a grand design. He says, "Our universe and its laws appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us, and if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. That is not easily explained and raises the natural question of why it is that way. The discovery relatively recently of the extreme fine-tuning of so many of the laws of nature could at least lead some of us to back the old idea that the grand design is the work of some grand designer." Even Hawking recognizes a grand design and devotes almost an entire chapter in his book, The Grand Design, to giving extensive detail to the spectacular fine-tuning both of the laws of nature and their physical constants. Robert Astro, God and the Astronomers, is a book that he wrote. And Robert Jastrow is an American astronomer. He's a physicist and cosmologist. He is actually the founder of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And he was an agnostic, not a believer. And there's a passage in his book where he says, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." Sir Roger Penrose, who I referred to earlier, again, he's an atheist and regarded as one of the leading mathematicians of our day. He says, "It seems as though someone has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming." And again, coming to Chandravik Ramasinger, who's a non-theist, he admits Darwinism requires blind faith, and there is no evidence for it. The emergence of life from a primordial soup on the earth is merely an article of faith that scientists are finding difficult to shed. There is no experimental evidence to support this. Indeed, all attempts to create life from non-life have been unsuccessful. Atheist biochemist admits the impossibility of Darwinism, and this is Michael Denton. "The complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it is impossible to accept that such an object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle." And perhaps one of the world's most notorious atheists, Antony Flew, later in his life, he was very much an outspoken atheist, comparable to who most would be familiar with, like a Richard Dawkins type. Later in life, he said, "I now believe there is a God. Yes, I now think the evidence, does point to a creative intelligence almost entirely because of the DNA investigations. The DNA material has shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinary diverse elements to work together. The meeting of these two parts at the right time by chance is simply minute. It is all a matter of the enormous complexity by which the results were achieved, which look to me like the work of intelligence." Antony Flew's change of heart, he said, "We have all the evidence we need in our immediate experience, and that only a deliberate refusal to look is responsible for atheism of any variety. Science spotlights three dimensions of nature that point to God. The first is the fact that nature obeys laws. The second is the dimension of life, of intelligently organized and purpose-driven beings which arose from matter. The third is the very existence of nature. But it is not science alone that guided me. I have also been helped by a renewed study of the classical philosophical arguments." Powerful language. So as I come to a conclusion here, I hope it's quite easy to see that faith in God, faith in an intelligent mind behind creation, is very much reasonable. And I love how Ravi Zacharias said it when he said, "God has put enough into the world to make faith in him a most reasonable thing, but he has left enough out to make it impossible to live by sheer reason or observation alone." Closing thoughts. So far from burying God, advancements in science have done far more to validate the existence of God. Believers should not be wary or afraid of what sound science discovers, for it is God who is the creator and designer of the whole show. Not just the bits we don't understand, but the bits we do understand. He's the creator of it all. And with each new discovery comes the unfolding of God's fingerprints and should only invigorate our faith. If your idea of God is a being who perfectly understands all truth, then the discovery of any truth should be awe-inspiring. It is in the very pursuit of truth, albeit incrementally, we become more like God. When you are on the side of truth, confidence abounds. Conclusion. Can every one of those at least 200 parameters have been perfectly met by accident? At what point is it fair to admit that it is science itself that suggests that we cannot be the result of random forces? Doesn't assuming that an intelligence created these perfect conditions in fact require far less faith than believing that a life-sustaining earth just happened to beat the inconceivable odds? And I'd like to wrap it up there. Hopefully that gives you some powerful information to consider. And for those of you who are believers in an intelligent mind being behind creation and life, hopefully this just adds to your belief and strengthens it. For those of you who may be watching who do not believe in an intelligent mind being behind creation of the earth, who are atheists, who are naturalists, reductionists, etc. I don't expect this to change your belief, but perhaps cause you to think more seriously or consider some of these things, and specifically, again, this idea of the evidence is all in front of us. Both the theist and the non-theist alike have the same evidence presented in front of them. Where does it more likely point towards? Does it point towards theism? Does it point towards atheism? And it is my conviction and my belief that undoubtedly the evidence overwhelmingly points to mind, points to intelligence, ultimately points to God. And I'll wrap it up there. I hope this has been helpful, and I would love to hear any comments and any feedback that you may have about this presentation.